who are joining online to this really extraordinary event. We are here with Rabbi Shai held a book event for his new book, Judaism is About Love. For those who are here in person, this microphone is only for the people who are online. It's not actually amplifying my voice. This evening we have with us a really esteemed panel, and I'll begin by introducing Rabbi Sharon Cohen Anisfeld. Rabbi Anisfeld is president of Hebrew College, where she previously served as dean of its rabbinical school. She graduated from the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College and spent 15 years working in pluralistic settings as a Hillel rabbi at Tufts, just down the street, at Yale, and right here at Harvard Hillel. Welcome back. She has a regular summer faculty. She's been a regular summer faculty member of the Groopman Youth Fellowships in Israel and is co-editor of 2 volumes of women's writings on Passover, the Women's Seder Sourcebook, Rituals and Readings for Use at the Passover Seder, and the Women's Passover Companion, Women's Reflections on the Festival of Freedom. From 2011 to 2013, she was named to Newsweek's list of top 50 influential rabbis in America. And in 2015, she was named one of the 50 most influential Jews in the world by the Jerusalem Post. I have never had a chance to meet Sharon in person until just about an hour or so ago. But Sharon, I want to take this moment just to thank you. The rabbinical school that you lead is a beacon of interdenominationalism or non-denominationalism, pluralism, and has trained some of the rabbis that I hold as my dearest colleagues, including Eli Lehman from Hadar, who's co-sponsoring this event, and my dear friend and colleague, Rabbi Getzel Davis. Welcome. The next 2 members of our panel are people that I have had the privilege of knowing a bit better, both in person and through their writings. And I'll say that when I read both of their writings, I find myself to sense the presence of the divine. With us here to my left is Dr. Jerome Groopman. He is the Dina and Raphael Rekanati Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School, Chief of Experimental Medicine at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and one of the world's leading researchers in cancer and AIDS. He's a staff writer for The New Yorker and has written for the New York Review of Books, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. He is author of The Measure of Our Days, Second Opinions, Anatomy of Hope, How Doctors Think, and the recently released Your Medical Mind. He is a dear friend at this point, and I thank you so much for joining us, Jerry. I'll also say amongst our students, Jerry is known as someone who is deeply caring and keeps up with our students even after they graduate, really goes above and beyond. And last but not least, of course, is Rabbi Shai held. Shai is a philosopher, a theologian, a biblical scholar. He is president and dean at the Hadar Institute. He received the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education and has been named multiple times by Newsweek as one of the 50 most influential rabbis in America and by the Jewish Daily Forward as one of the 50 most prominent Jews in the world. He's the author of Judaism is About Love, the focus of our conversation this evening, and also Abram Joshua Heschel, The Call of Transcendence, and the compilation of drashot on the Parsha, The Heart of Torah. And most recently, he started a podcast called Answers Withheld. Rabbi Shai, welcome. I just want to thank our sponsors for this evening. Gary Katz and Diane Katz are sponsoring this event in honor of Shai and in honor of our board member, Michael Kaplan and Jen Kaplan. So thank you so much, Gary and Diane, for that. I also want to thank our co-host this evening, first and foremost, Hadar and Eli Lehman, who's outside taking registration, the Harvard Bookstore, and Hebrew College. The structure for this evening, we're going to begin with some remarks from Rabbi Shai, highlighting some of the key elements of his new book. And then we'll have some questions and back and forth from our 2 other panelists. So I'll begin here with Rav Shai.
Thank you. Thank you, Donnie. Thank you, all of you, for being here. You omitted the 2 most important facts of my biography, which is I am a former student president of Harvard Hillel, 92, and former staff member from 99 to 02. So it feels a little bit like coming home. I don't know if anyone remembers Paul Simon, Lahavdil. Paul Simon in the Central Park concert gets up and says, "It's great to do a neighborhood concert." So it's great to be here. Thank you all for being here. I think I'll begin by saying just a couple sentences about how I came to write this book. And it really begins with two moments that took place a couple of months apart in 1999. I was speaking to a group of senior rabbinical students. I write about this in the beginning of my book, a group of senior rabbinical students at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And I said in passing, Judaism is a story about a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. And one of the rabbinical students responded somewhat sneeringly and said, I'm sorry, but that just sounds like Christianity to me. And I was really taken aback. And I said, you know, it's very interesting that that's your response, because I was actually thinking about the twice-a-day Jewish liturgy, in which we say, Ahava rabbah ahavtanu, with vast love have you loved us. And then immediately we recite Deuteronomy, V'ahavta Hashem Elohecha, and you should love the Lord your God. That's a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. If that makes you think about Christianity, then we have to ask just how and why Jews, including knowledgeable Jews, passionate Jews, just how deeply we've internalized traditional Christian anti-Jewish tropes. We believe what they say about what they've said about us, and that's just a huge problem. Then this second experience I don't write about in the book, but I sort of now regret that I didn't. I was speaking at an interfaith conference for high school kids. And this is kind of, it was the 1990s, but it was set up as if it were the 1950s. The kids were divided into Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. Right? So I'm speaking to the Protestant kids. And again, in passing, I say, remind me, what does Jesus say is the great command? And 20 hands, all the kids in the room raise their hands. I call on one. He very proudly tells me about love of neighbor and love of God. And then I say, sort of, Mesiach lefitumi, just innocently talking. I say, and remind me, what is Jesus quoting? Not a single hand goes up. Not a single one. By the way, the answer is Leviticus and Deuteronomy, Vayikra and Devarim. And so I had this moment where I thought, no wonder why they can tell a story whereby Judaism was loveless and Christianity came to fill a hole in Judaism, because none of these kids have been taught what wells Jesus drank from. Like, not a single one of them can raise their hand. So I wrote this book really for two audiences. One, the primary audience is Jews. It's an act of reclamation and recovery, of trying to recenter what I think has always been there and become submerged and muted over time. And the other is to write for Christians. I cannot tell you how many Christians I have met who are genuinely hungry to have some kind of new understanding of of Judaism, but have no idea how to go about it. I had a conversation recently that was very, very moving to me with a woman named Patricia Lyons, who's a professor at an Anglican seminary. And she said to me, our alums come to these continuing ed retreats, and I hear the same thing over and over again. I know that I cannot preach from the pulpit about Judaism what I learned in seminary. I know it's outdated and I know it's offensive. I have no idea what to say instead. And her comment to me was, my hope is that I can start giving them this book, which I found to be just very, very touching. If it can in some small way contribute to that, then, you know, that's a real bracha and a blessing for me. Now, I think that it's also worth saying that it's not just anti-Judaism. It's also that at a certain moment in American Jewish history, and no one has quite documented when this happened, but everyone sort of agrees that it did happen, that American Jews who were anxious about assimilation began to define Judaism as whatever they imagined Christianity was not. The problem was this was often based on a pretty cardboard understanding of Christianity, and then a kind of cardboard understanding of Judaism in response. So this kind of story about, oh, well, Christians focus on love, we must focus on law or justice or some other thing. The most dramatic example of this, if it sounds kind of far-fetched, is that generations of American Jewish children have been taught that Judaism has no notion of the afterlife. Right? This is the classic trope of American Jewish education that is based on only one thing, the Jewish fantasy that Christianity is entirely focused on the afterlife, right? Therefore, we must have no notion of the afterlife. This is, I always like to say, this is a caricature of Christianity and Judaism, but otherwise it's quite a helpful distinction. It's really kind of an absurdity. And so that combination of sort of internalizing anti-Judaism and then wanting to define ourselves as over against, I think has been a really toxic influence on how Jews think about Judaism. And by the way, there is a lot of social science research about how minority groups come to see themselves the way the majority group sees them. Because Jews in America are a fairly successful group, we don't tend to think about the ways in which minority, but we are religiously very much a minority. And I think that in all kinds of ways, Jews understand themselves in ways that are shaped by the way Christians have seen and often continue to see us. What do I mean by love? That's like a small question, right? So I want to be clear that when I talk about love, I am not primarily talking about an emotion. I am talking instead about an orientation, a way of being in the world, a way of comporting ourselves. The term that I sort of came up with for this, which is impossibly pretentious, but it was extremely helpful for me in my own thinking, is that love is an existential posture. Love is a way that I hold myself. Now, that posture has to manifest in moments of emotion, but it itself is not an emotion. And that's important because, first of all, you cannot build a spiritual life on a particular feeling, for example, because if you meditate for 15 seconds, you'll discover that emotions come and go. Nobody's answer, if I say to you, right, is your life oriented around love, and you think I'm talking about a feeling, your answer will change constantly. But if it's a posture, that's different. In philosophy, we sometimes call this a disposition to act and feel in certain ways. That's what love is from a Jewish perspective. It's a disposition to act in certain ways and a disposition to feel in certain ways. The example of this that I give, but only when I'm traveling far from home, is that if you said to me at 2:30 in the afternoon on a work day, what is your primary feeling right now? Loving my wife is not usually one of those top three things. I'm grumpy. I'm like, a little tired. I'm irritated by things I don't want to do. But if you ask me, are you oriented around love for your spouse? I would say, yeah, totally. And it's just a deeper, more fundamental thing. And I think one of the things that happens in our culture, I wish I kind of talked about this more in the book, is that when we tell people that spiritual life is based on emotions, we lead to one of two things. Either people lie to themselves, right? I don't know if this is the crowd to say this. It's like the guy in every Karlbach minion who walks around going, hey, brother. And meanwhile, they're like a seething cauldron of unconscious rage. Right? So it's like you lie to yourself. You've all met the guy. He's at every minion. It's usually a he, not always, but usually, right? Or people give up and say, I'm not capable of that, right? I once went to the library and took out every self-help book about gratitude that had come out in the last 25 years. There were many. The librarian was like, are you okay? It was like, and I sat and I started reading through these, at which point my colleague Ellie Confer wondered why I get paid. But so I was reading these books, and it was striking to me how many of these books talked about gratitude as if it was a feeling. But then they talk about feeling grateful all the time. And I was like, well, that's completely incoherent all the way down. I would like to say my life is oriented around gratitude. My primary feeling for the last 5 months has been grief and indignation, not gratitude. That doesn't mean that I'm not a grateful person. And it's a totally misapprehension. So to suggest otherwise, and I think it's very important that we learn to think about love in this way. Love is an orientation, both to think, also to think in certain ways, but to feel in certain ways and to act in certain ways. Another example of this, if it's helpful, is marital love. And here everyone gets nervous when I say this, right? I don't think marriage is based on the emotion of love. I think marriage is based on the existential posture of love, which again manifests at moments in emotion. But nobody goes through life feeling loosey-goosey love for their spouse at all times. In fact, one of the things you learn as a Hillel rabbi, it's just true. So I don't know. I was a Hillel rabbi a long time ago. Most of the students here were not even born yet. But I would regularly have young undergraduate men come to me and say, I think I have to break up with my girlfriend. And I would say, why? Right? And they would say something like, I'm not like obsessed with her anymore. And I would say sometimes, which is in retrospect really unhelpful, this is a great day for you. Now you can have a relationship. And most of them had no idea what I meant, and it was not a helpful response. But the point I think is actually important. I argue in this book that Judaism has 5.5 love commands. And I'll just enumerate them for a minute. 3 of them, you know, because they are explicit in the Torah: love of neighbor, love of God, and love of the ger or stranger. Then, based on later Jewish sources, including rabbinic sources and modern rabbinic sources, notably Rabbi Yaakov Emden, I talk about a 4th mitzvah, which is love of all humanity, because love of neighbor in Vayikra, at least in Leviticus, clearly means love of your fellow Jew. I think there is no coherent way to read those verses otherwise, although there have been many great sages who have done so for noble reasons. But there's another mitzvah that's about loving all human beings who are created in the image of God. And then the notion of walking in God's ways, which the sages understand as both the feelings and the actions that we usually describe as compassion. And if your response to that is to say, but wait, I thought we're talking about love and not compassion, that leads me to make one additional fundamental point about love. And this is a point that I came to in my writing about Judaism, but then I noticed that this is also a trend in modern moral philosophy to talk about love as an umbrella term for a series of postures and emotions rather than love as a particular emotion. Right? Love as a catch-all for certain kinds of pro-social emotions: kindness, generosity, compassion. One of the ways that this really struck me is that if you look at the language of the Babylonian Talmud, in Talmudic Aramaic, there is no way to distinguish compassion from love. The root in Aramaic for love is resh chet mem, right? Which is the Hebrew, which most people associate with mercy, right? Or compassion, rachamim. Right? Talmudic Aramaic has no way to distinguish. When we call God Rachamana, that can be translated as the merciful one, the loving one. It's all kind of, in some sense, one family of postures and emotions. How much time do I have?
You're good.
I'm good. I want to actually just, oh, sorry. And so I think I said 5. Did I say 5.5 love commandments? So the half. The hardest chapter for me to write in this book by far was the chapter on whether it's a mitzvah to love your enemies. And the reason it was so difficult is because there is so much kind of simplistic stereotype around this. Like some version of, everyone in this room has heard some version of Christianity says love your enemies, but Judaism says, and then fill in some blank, defend yourself, right? Of course, by the way, those are not actually opposites. So one could argue that you could love your enemies and protect yourself. But I think this is a place where the over-againstness of Judaism and Christianity has been quite destructive. And one of the things that I do in this chapter is try to mine some of the ways that ideas that Jews usually associate with Christianity are fundamental to rabbinic Judaism. Here's an example, and it's amazing to me because I say this to frum crowds. I say this to crowds of people who daven 3 times a day, and at first they have no idea what I'm talking about, even though they say this liturgy every day. So I say, central to the rabbinic tradition is the ethos of non-retaliation. So much so that it's part of the Amida. And inevitably people are like, wait, what? Where's that? Every Amida ends with the following phrase, "V'lemakalelai nafshi tidom." And to those who curse me, may my soul be silent. And the rabbis valorize those who are insulted but refuse to insult in return. The ethos of non-retaliation, at least in the personal sphere, is really central to rabbinics. Where it gets harder, of course, is when Christians start talking about love of enemies in the context of horrific violence. And what I would say here is that I think both Jewish and Christian discussions of love of enemy suffer from a failure of definition. In other words, when I talk about enemies, am I talking about the guy at work I kind of don't like? Am I talking about the cousin I used to have a business with, but then I caught him cheating and haven't talked to him since? Or am I talking about Saddam Hussein? It's not obvious to me that ethically or spiritually, the answer is obviously the same in all those cases. And I think that the discussion is actually quite impoverished in both traditions by not really being willing to think about that. And when I say that, so I call it half a love commandment because it depends what we mean. There are ways in which it is clearly a mitzvah to love your neighbor. The Midrash imagines two donkey drivers. This is like a very, classic kind of rabbinic image, right? Two donkey drivers. You can imagine as two Uber drivers, right? One of them passes the other one whose donkey has fallen. And if you are Baki and Chumash, if you know the Bible well, you know that it's specifically a mitzvah if your enemy's donkey has fallen to help them. But he passes his enemy and with his donkey, and he gets 100 yards past, and he thinks to himself, wait a minute. The law says that I'm supposed to actually have stopped and helped him. So he drags himself back. He helps the guy. And then this really sweet midrash is they start chatting and they go into an inn together and they end the night as friends. And this is used as proof, which is just wonderful, as proof that God's laws are righteousness. That is, what begins as the observance of a law ends in the repair of a relationship. Right? And so the way in which that's all about loving enemies, or if you prefer, converting enemies into friends. Mi oyev le'ohev. The reason I found this chapter so hard, among other things, Sydney, you read a version of this at some point. I am not exaggerating when I say that I wrote 25 different conclusions to this chapter. I would sit at my desk, I would write a conclusion, and I would say, yeah, this is pretty much what I think. And then I would wake up the next day and go back to my computer and say, this is not what I think. And eventually, the conclusion that I wrote was about how I think when it comes to questions like loving enemies, religions are at their best, not when they pretend to have answers, but when they give us better language for questions. They teach us to live better with the questions that are incredibly difficult. Right? The last thing I wanted to do in a chapter on love of enemies was offer psak about something, right? Offer like some halachic decision. I really wanted to open up just how complex some of these questions are, and that many of our assumptions are actually quite simplistic and not helpful. I'll make one last comment and then I'll stop. I wanted to just share one image that has become very important to me, and actually more so since I finished the book. One image about love of God. In the chapter on loving God, one of the pictures I try to paint about what it means to love God is to acknowledge that God has created a home for us to live in and to attempt to return the favor. That is to say, our task as those who have been gifted with a world is to make this the kind of world that God is willing to dwell in. And it only kind of fully registered to me after the book was done that that's actually the structure of the beginning of Breshit through the end of Shemot. The beginning of Breshit is God creating a home for people to live in, and the end of Shemot is human beings creating a world, a mini world, a microcosm, a Mishkan for God to live in. And the language around the construction of the Mishkan is an exact echo of the language of the creation of the world. So that's not some like modern pretty idea that I had. That's actually the Chumash. That's actually what the Bible is saying about the sort of vision of a religious life. God made a world for us. Will we do the same for God? I find that to be just a really provocative, difficult, challenging, daunting idea. And I'll leave you with that for now.
Thank you, Shai. I will turn first to Dr. Groopman to ask some questions of Shai.
Questions?
Questions? And,
Yeah.
Want to respond first? Want to respond?
Yeah.
Just, I'll take a little liberty here to say that the last book that was published, Your Medical Mind, was with Dr. Pamela Harsband, who happens to be my wife. So there we are. So the Ahafta is the imperative. We're commanded to love. And whether it be a posture, an existential posture, or whether it be a emotional existential experience, God is described as Ein Cheka, unfathomable. How do you relate love to a deity that cannot be understood?
I thought you were responding first. You're just going to give me questions? Wasn't expecting that. So here's a really profoundly irritating response. We have to define what we mean by unfathomable.
You do have smicha.
That's not a smicha thing. That's unfortunately a philosophy thing. But so let me try to answer this in two ways. One is that when you ask the question, it reminds me of something extraordinary that Rabbi Judah Lowy of Prague, the Maharal, says in the 16th century, which is, I'm supposed to love God, but I can't see this thing that I'm supposed to love. But there is something that I can see that is a visible manifestation of that God, which is an image of God. So the most concrete way I can love God is by loving images of God. I say that, but I also hesitate because I think that a lot of Jewish thinkers end up getting tripped up here, Christians as well, by the idea that love of God should be reducible to love of neighbor. Love of God must dramatically include love of neighbor, may even center on love of neighbor, but isn't equivalent to love of neighbor. If I say to my wife, I love you so much, and the way I'm going to manifest that is by being incredibly good to our children, my wife might say, well, that's lovely, but could you pay some attention to me? And that's what things like Talmud Torah and Shabbat and various forms of halachot ben adam lamakom, of laws that are about a relationship with God, come in. Since you talked about unfathomability, I want to say one thing here that is very, very important to me. Many of you have heard me talk about this text a lot. One of the most important passages in Tanakh in my own thinking that really kind of shaped my project as whatever you want to say, a theologian, I guess, is a moment in the book of Hosea. The 11th chapter of Hosea is one of the most exquisite things you find in the Hebrew Bible. Hosea imagines God, or hears God saying, I wish I could give up on the Jewish people. I mean, I know that's anachronistic, but I wish I could give up on you because frankly, you drive me crazy. I wish that I could treat you like I treated Sodom and Amorah, but I can't. And do you know why I can't? And then comes this unbelievable moment. Ki el anochi v'lo ish, because I am God and not a person. Now, to be unforgivably anachronistic, this is Hosea's assault on the whole tradition of medieval philosophy, right? Medieval philosophy says, oh, God loves us. Oh, but God is unfathomable and other, which means that God doesn't really love us, right? And Hosea says, you know what, Rambam, hold your horses. The opposite is the case, right? God loves us. And you know what it means that God is unfathomable? God loves us so deeply that no human love ever comes close to the kind of love that God has. Human beings give up on each other. Sometimes you might argue even legitimately, but God says, I can't. Because I'm God, my love has unfathomable depths. That's an exquisite theological claim. And by the way, that is not in the New Testament, right? That's Hosea's vision of theology. And I mean, we get into this another time. Hosea is in many ways the first Jewish theologian in that he is the first Jewish text that explicitly reflects on what it means to use metaphor for talking about God, right? He says, I love you, but I'm not a person. But that doesn't mean I don't love. It means I love in ways you don't even begin to understand. This is one of the greatest lines Abraham Joshua Heschel ever had, and it's not just a clever line, it's totally an amazing insight. He says, if you understand the prophets, you realize that attributing love to God is not an anthropomorphism. Attributing love to humans is a theomorphism.
Sharon.
Do you want to say a little bit about your own response before? Yeah, you were going to share. You were going to share a little bit.
I've got some more to ask of Jerry, but I think I want to hear if you want to maybe.
Okay.
And Shai, maybe you can begin by responding. And how has Shai's book affected your own thinking and being.
Okay. So I will speak to that a little bit, and actually it will lead into a question, and then we can toss back for another question. First of all, thank you so much for this opportunity to be here. And Shai, thank you for all of your teaching, and especially in this moment for writing this stunning book. I am someone who tends to carry certain books, essays, poems sort of close to me for decades, and live with them and return to them. And as I was reading this, I had a very strong sense that this is going to be a book that I'm going to be carrying close, probably for the rest of my life, for the next several decades. It's going to take a lot of rereading and studying the Chavruta. As I said to you, it feels, thank you for all those pages of footnotes because really.
For those who are intimidated by the length of this book, about half of it is footnotes.
Right. So don't be intimidated. Right.
I'll try to explain myself afterwards.
So for now, I wanted to just say two things kind of personally about how it's landed with me and affected me thus far. And I wanted to do that by focusing in on a sentence in the first chapter of the book, where you say, I'm quoting, "God's love is not something we earn, but rather something we ought to strive to live up to." And you go on to say, this is a good definition of Judaism's vision of the spiritual life, the attempt to live up to God's love. So I have to say that I was both very moved and actually kind of startled when I read this sentence because, and I'm going to speak a little personally here, but it was the first time I had come across such a clear articulation of actually something that I experienced in one of those sort of most intense, intimate, and unbidden moments of prayer that I've ever had in my life. And it's interesting you alluded to this because it was during the Ava Rabbah prayer, Ava Rabbah Avtanu Adonai Eloheinu, with a great, big, vast love you have loved us. And I was in a shul, we were singing these words for a while. And I know this starts with emotion, but it doesn't end there. So anyway, the only way I can describe the experience in that moment was I sort of started to feel a wave wash over me of basically all the love I had received in my life. And as that wave kind of washed up, on the shores of my heart, the question that emerged, the question that I found myself davening was, how will I ever possibly do justice to all the love I have received? It was completely irrelevant, any distinction, which love from whom. It was just all, all the love I received. So why do I mention this? Partly because it really was so amazing to come across that sentence and feel that jolt of recognition. But also because I think it highlights a tension that I felt throughout reading the book and that I'm carrying with me. And that is, I think you meant and mean for this awareness that we are loved, that we're created with love for love, as you say in the book. You mean that as a source of comfort and a sort of insistence on the irreducibility of our worth. And I really understand that and occasionally even feel it. But it also evokes for me, as I'm sort of describing in this moment, and I think you acknowledge this also certainly implicitly, and I think explicitly, but it also evokes this sort of almost impossible sense of longing and aspiration of how do I live up to this sense of, how much love we are on the receiving end of. So there's something in that gap with all its heartache and hope and humanity that feels really important to me, and that I'm carrying with me in a new way because of your work in this book. So the one other thing I'll say briefly, and this will lead into the question, is that reading this book in the months since October 7th has been both profoundly comforting. I said to you earlier, I think on top of everything else, the theological, philosophical, intellectual contribution, I think this was a really profound pastoral contribution you've made in bringing this book into the world right now. So it's been very comforting, but also heart-wrenching because of the gap between the Torah you're teaching, which is the Torah that I want to animate my life, and the gap between that and the world that we're inhabiting, and the bridge feels like the gap feels like an unbridgeable chasm. So I think that's the question I wanted to start with, is kind of how you think about that gap. There can be almost a cruelty in holding out a vision that feels so far from where we are. But obviously there's also a very dangerous and sort of quiet violence to letting go of that vision. So how do you think about that gap? How do you think Judaism asks us, or maybe even helps us, to live in that gap?
That was a lot of things. Thank you. Actually, if it's okay, I want to say one thing about your first comment. Your comment to me encapsulates a moment in Jewish liturgy in which we say a rhetorical question, Ma ashiv l'Adonai kol tagmulo hi alai. What could I possibly do to repay all of this, right? All of this generosity. And that in turn reminds me of a wonderful line by a Catholic philosopher who says, no man can ever say to God, now we're even. That's part of what it means, I think, to live a religious life, is to know that the debt for the gift of life is never fully repayable. Not sure.
It's amazing.
Okay.
It's on that point, exactly.
Yeah. One of the ways that I think about the challenge that you're raising, and this is so counterintuitive to a lot of Jews, is that what makes it possible is the belief in the radical forgivingness of God. I'll tell you something that I learned from, wait for it, an ex-girlfriend of mine. An ex-girlfriend of mine who is frum and totally not religious. Okay? It's a genre many of you are familiar with. She was frum and not religious. She said to me once, it was an amazing comment. She said, you know why I'm not Christian? And I was like, oh boy. Right? And she said, I don't feel I need the Son because the Father forgives me. And I said, that's actually one of the most profound and interesting theological things I've ever heard in my life. And I think you're onto something really profound. In other words, we don't need to be saved because God has faith in us. There's an amazing midrash in Sifrei. I think I talk about this in the conclusion. It is, I think, really painful. It actually bridges to your second question. God is described in Deuteronomy as El Emunah, which means a faithful God. But the sages choose to read that as God is a God who has faith. She'emin ba'olam u'vera'ah. God believed in the world and therefore created it. Now, empirically speaking, this was not a good judgment on God's part. I like to say, on the one hand, we have our theology. On the other hand, there's the front page of the New York Times. It's hard. That's the chasm. That's the chasm. And it is very tempting sometimes to say, okay, so I'm not going to read the New York Times and I'll just have my theology off in its hermetically sealed world. Or to say, look, I read the New York Times. I am deeply cynical. Or as people who have become deeply cynical often say, I'm like wizened up, right? And in fact, I would argue that the Jewish spirituality demands of us is holding our theology in one end and the New York Times in the other, and somehow learning to live in the chasm. We claim, I don't upload to the New York Times in this day and age, but fine, hold the mirror up or your phone or whatever it might be. But it's actually about acknowledging and living in the chasm between what we claim about the world. Every human being is infinitely valuable. God cares about us. And the reality that we see, which is that human dignity is trodden and trampled upon in countless ways all the time, every day. And God often seems somewhere between uninterested or non-existent. Right? And we have to live with that chasm. One of the chapters of this book is about this notion that I developed that you find in certain other philosophers as well, the notion of waiting for God. I got really interested in this passage in the Talmud, in which we're told that one of the questions that a person is asked when they die is, Tzipita Yeshua, did you wait for redemption? And for a long time, I used to think, like, what does it mean to wait for redemption? Right? So there's one thing I'm confident it doesn't mean, right? Friend walks into your house on a Sunday afternoon, they see you on the couch, feet up on a coffee table, watching football, 2 bags of potato chips on your belly, and they say, what are you doing? And you say, what does it look like I'm doing? I'm waiting for redemption, right? That can't be waiting for redemption. So the question is, what does it mean to wait actively? What does it mean to wait actively? And I think what it means here, just for the sheer joy of pretentiousness, I will use this word. What it means is prolepsis. Okay? Next, what prolepsis means? What it means is you create moments which anticipate what you believe the future can and must be. So I believe what it means to say that we're asked if we anticipated redemption is, did you create moments in your life where you did the presence of the manifest? Did you create a classroom or a city block or a child's bedroom where human dignity was truly protected? Did you create oceans of God fullness in a world that seems so God-forsaken? That to me is the only way to live with the gap. The only way to live with the gap is to create moments of the future. And if that doesn't sound totally Jewish to you, I would just remind you that that's literally how Chazal understands Shabbat. That's what it means to say Olam Haba. It is a foretaste. It is an anticipation of what we imagine the world will one day be. Right? That does not mean we have a really good Shabbos. It means that I live in a time that is all Shabbos. But in the meantime, when Tuesday overwhelms me, on Shabbat, I enter another reality. I'm sort of suggesting that ritual is not enough in this way. It's also about, what do I create in my home? What do I create in my classroom? What do I create on my college campus? What do I create? What are the ways in which I anticipate redemption? And this is really hard if we want to stay awake.
I think the Gemara, the Talmud, or Tosfot says that the Yom Shakul Shabbat, the day end is all Shabbat, is actually when there are no more people left, and therefore there'll be full peace and resting. Jay, I want to ask you, how has Shai's book affected you? How has it landed with you, influenced your own thinking and being?
First of all, I love the book. Not just because we're friends, objectively. Also, it's very, very wide-ranging. Most of the discussion tonight has been theological, I would say. What struck me about the book is how deeply it extends to secular sources and wrestles with controversies and ideas that are surprising and move out of the expected. And one of them that particularly struck me was your discussion about parenting. You know, how parenting fits in to this paradigm of Judaism and love. And so what I found was that it was an important statement with regard to the opening of the book about the counterpoint to Christianity, that you know, Judaism is law and Christianity is love and so on. But what really grabbed me was the breadth and the depth of your treatment of subjects which you wouldn't necessarily think of in theological terms. And so I don't know if you'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about the parenting dimension, because that really resonated with me.
Thank you. Maybe I'll share two things I say in the book about parenting that have been helpful to me as I grope towards being a good parent. One is that there's this thing that Martin Buber does that I think is kind of amazing. I know, I'm weird, but just bear with me. So Martin Buber, when he's young, writes this book that you've all heard of, many of you have read, I and Now, in which he says, in the beginning was the relation. That is, we are constituted by the way in which we interact with or relate to other things. And then, decades later, he writes an essay in which he begins in a totally different way. And he says, before there can be a relation, there must first be what he calls, because he's German, a primal setting at a distance, by which he means, I can't have a relationship with you unless and until I have first acknowledged that you are a separate being from me. In the beginning was not the relation. In the beginning was the willingness to let you be you rather than an extension of my will. Now, I don't know, by the way, whether Buber thought he was explicating what he always meant or whether he is actually changing his mind. But it feels to me like an awful lot of love depends first and foremost on allowing those we love to be other than we. And by the way, parents who totally fail at parenting often do so because they have the narcissistic problem of not being able to let their kids be other than extensions of their own will. Most damaged families stem from that. By the way, that's also extremely theological because I would argue that that's the risk that God takes in creating a world. A world in which God runs everything is a world that doesn't exist as a world. It's actually a form of pantheism, right? Because the world is not separate from God. But the point is, God creates a world and us within it as persons rather than puppets, which means God has to acknowledge and make space for us to be us and not merely extensions of God's will. I think this is really hard for a lot of people. You know, many of us probably think, oh, I'm totally cool with my kids being different from me, as long as we share all the same most fundamental values, right? And then your kid comes home and tells you, I don't know, they're an atheist. They're a Republican. They voted for Ben Gvir. No, the point is, no, then you should write that out. No, the point is, the point I think is actually really quite important and really fundamental and hard. The other thing is an image that I'll share with you that I end the chapter on family with that really, I think this is one of the most beautiful comments I have ever read in the Jewish tradition. The Kli Yakar, okay? A wildly expansive homiletical commentary on the Torah. He asks the question, why do we do this extremely bizarre thing at shul where the Baal Tfilah, the prayer leader, says the words of Birkat Kohanim before the Kohanim say it? Says, this is just bizarre. Presumably the Kohanim who are up there know the word. People know what I'm talking about, right? Right? Because what are we doing? And he says, oh, we're not prompting them. It's that actually the prayer leader is blessing the Kohanim. And that being blessed is what enables them in turn to bless the congregation. Because if they're not filled up with love first, they can't love. And I sort of suggest that at the end of the day, that's what it means to run a household, is to actually try to create the conditions that allow our children to walk into the world able to love. And the way to do that is to love them, right? Is to prompt them. You fill them with love and then you send them out into the world. And I just want to say, this is a really hard thing to talk about because for many of us, our experiences in our homes were very different from that, right? And so in some ways, for many of us, it's a project of repairing, of creating an alternative, creating something different than what we saw. But the vision, go back to this language of aspiration, the aspiration of what a Jewish home is, in part, is a school for love.
So Shai, you joke a bit about the child who might vote for Ben-Gvir.
Oh, really? You're going to do this, Tony? Okay. Okay.
But you talk about family, and I think it's the philosopher Michael Wishergard who talks about the significance of Abraham being chosen with his family, because that allows for a bond. The familial bond is being chosen, and people within a family disagree with each other. But at the same time, you write in your book, to love the Jewish people is in part to love its ideals. After all, as the Jewish philosopher Saadia Gaon tells us, the Jewish people is a people only by virtue of the Torah. We are, or ought to be, a people in service of its ideals. And so on the one hand, when you talk about this sense of loving a fellow Jew, if you share the same ideals, then you're bonded by those ideals. But what about the Jew who you're commanded to love differently from humanity, as you discuss in the book, who, whatever, you can choose your example, votes for Ben-Gvir, a Republican, or is an atheist. And then Sharon, I want to hear, Shai, your response, but Sharon, I also want to hear from you. You run a...
I would rather hear from Sharon. Sharon's like, I didn't sign up for this. Okay.
You've spent your life in pluralistic institutions. You lead a pluralistic institution that has as part of it a rabbinical school. And especially in this moment, how do we foster love amongst people who don't share our ideals? I gave you time to think, Shai.
Yeah, sorry. I feel like there's a couple of questions in what you said. One is, I have to say, this is like the ultimate cop-out. I wrote that sentence with some ambivalence because it's really interesting that in the history of religious Zionism, there was a real rejection of that notion of Saadia's, that the people are constituted by the Torah, and instead the argument that there was a people first that accepted the Torah. And that was really important to religious Zionists because that's what validated working with non-religious Zionists. If people follow what I just said, was that clear? In other words, it was like, no, it's like, we're not, oh, you are, to use a good Jewish, ochel nevelotu trefot b'farhesia, right? You are like totally not observant in any way, but that's okay because on some level we are a people beforehand. And the reason I was ambivalent writing this sentence is that my experience is very much that religious Zionist thing and not Saadia. The reason I'm drawn to Saadia is that I have a lot of ambivalence about the way some Jews talk obsessively about power and Jewish interests. Because I think the paradox of Judaism, this is something that Label Fine used to say, the Jewish people has no greater interest in the pursuit of its own values. And that means that there's always going to be a kind of paradox. Judaism is never going to be only about the physical flourishing of Jews. Judaism is always going to be about serving certain ideals. I know that's not really much of an answer, but it's the best answer I can give, meaning I think that probably we have to hold to some kind of dialectic between, on the one hand, we are a people before Torah, there's something like rawly ethnic, and yet we ought to be really cautious about peoplehood as just this raw, irreducible fact, not animated by some set of values and aspirations. I just think that that's just a really dangerous way to go through the world. Now, about the pluralism piece. So I want to share a story that I heard last week. Some of you may have actually been on Zoom when this happened. I did a launch event in New York with Congressman Jamie Raskin. And Jamie shared something that really, really touched me very deeply and has been sitting with me ever since. When we got to talking about love of enemies, Jamie said, I want to say something here at B'nai Jeshurun in Manhattan. Lauren Boebert is a good friend of mine. And let me tell you why. I disagree with Lauren Boebert about everything. But when I was diagnosed with cancer, more than almost anyone else in Congress, Lauren Boebert was totally there, physically there with me. And I said to her, you know, Lauren, you're wrong about everything. But it means so much that you're here. And then, by the way, because he's Jamie Raskin, it's very funny. He said, notice I'm not talking about Marjorie Taylor Greene. But the point is this. The point is that I think that what Jamie's story points to is that you can disagree with someone about everything and still insistently look for the ways in which they are a human being capable of love. This is like that famous passage in Likutei Moharan of Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, right? Where he says, you know, right, if you look at a person's life, surely there is something they've done that is valuable. I always say, when you say about someone, they are totally insufferable, just ask yourself about the totally. Are they totally insufferable? People I don't like are mostly insufferable. They're not totally insufferable. Well, I could think of one, but the point is, so I think that to me, that's very important. In other words, there's pluralism around ideas, and there's like, oh, I believe in, like, you know, the integrity of disagreement and the ways that, you know, Talmidei Chachamim sharpen each other. There's all of that. But then there's something even more fundamental, which is, oh, Lauren Boebert is committed to the mitzvah of Bikur Cholim. And that's really important. And Jamie Raskin really likes her. And I don't know, like, it's really important to me as a model. There's maybe I'll share this because I imagine this is a fairly politically liberal crowd in not Ira, but everybody else. In the political reporter Tim Alberta, who is a son of an evangelical minister, deeply kind of pious evangelical Christian, and his most recent new book is just an impassioned cri de coeur about the way MAGA has destroyed American Christianity. It's a very moving and intense book. But one of the things he talks about, and it's really where you see Tim Alberta's humanity, because he's so angry about the way all these ministers have completely sold their soul, right? But then he talks about how his father's old congregants who say the most obscene things about immigrants and, you know, talk about loving your enemies, but wear "Let's Go Brandon" t-shirts, right? And he says, you know, like, they're hypocrites of the worst kind. He says, but like, then I pay attention to all the chesed they do. Like, these same people are serving food in homeless shelters. These same people have churches that collect food for people who don't have anything. And they do it without drawing attention to themselves. And he says, like, they're not monsters. He says they're people who have been totally misguided by their leaders, in Tim Alberta's opinion, but they're human beings. And that means that they're capable of love. And that means that there's always the possibility of connection and reconnection. And that's really important. Seeing the humanity of a person is not dependent on agreeing with them or even finding their views, what's the opposite of reprehensible? Unreprehensible.
So I think in some ways I'm going to pick up on a few elements of what Shai said, but Donnie, I think the way you formulated the question was sort of what does it mean to, or how do you cultivate love for or among people who don't share your ideals? So I want to respond to that, but then, because I think that's actually the easier question, and then just tease apart two other questions that I'm hearing in kind of embedded in that. But this really echoes what Shai was just saying. I mean, on some level, loving people who don't share my ideals or share my values is sort of pshita. That's actually, I love all kinds of people who don't share my values because we are more than one thing. You know, I think we're living in this cultural moment where we have also kind of flattened people to their opinions. And I mean, my opinions are one really important part of who I am, or even my values, but there are all kinds of, you know, sometimes I think about this in terms of all you have to do is think about a time when you've traveled somewhere in your life, you know, somewhere remote, and you think about the people you encounter in those places, and you have no idea what they think about anything. You know, do they help schlep your stuff? Do they share their food? You know, all of those. So anyway, I just think we're living in a moment where we have reduced each other too much to what we think about issues. So the people with whom I am in a thicker relationship where it just, and I'm not talking about close friends, but just a thicker relationship in community, right? There are all kinds of ways in which we see each other and get to know each other and experience different dimensions of each other that make it actually not that hard to love each other. But the two things that feel harder for me, more complicated for me in what you're saying, one is I am noticing a growing concern in the pluralistic worlds that I travel in. I would say this has gotten more intense probably since 2016, just to pick a date, but that a fear, and I understand the fear, a fear that depolarizing is actually a way of demobilizing people who are, you know, concerned about and engaged in and trying to be active on really important issues. And so I, as someone who am concerned about polarization, I hear the critique back sometimes, which is, well, if you try to depolarize, you're going to demobilize people who are doing, or you're trying to demobilize people who are doing really important work. So I think that's an important conversation to have, an important thing, you know, that I'm certainly wrestling with. That feels really different from the question of loving people. Yeah. And then the one other just about, you know, peoplehood and the Jewish people and what that means, love of the Jewish people means. And I just want to bring in one other, another kind of language to that, which is, I don't know what it means for me to love Ben Gvir, honestly. You know, I'm not sure that's the central question for me. But I do know that, or I feel very strongly that we are implicated in each other's lives and destinies. And that feels very clear to me. So a sense of sort of inextricability with the Jewish people, including Jewish people who really do not share my ideals or Jewish values. In actually one of the things that I feel like I learned in my years in Hillel was that specifically around Israel and Israel politics was that shame. I came to understand or to see shame as very much the other side of pride. They're both dimensions of belonging. You don't feel ashamed of something that you don't feel implicated in, and that so that when I would hear, Jewish students feeling ashamed about something going on in Israel. I really came to understand in a deep way that that's an expression of belonging. And so let's start from there, as opposed to sort of othering. So just...
Thank you. We're going to have some time for Q&A from the audience. I know Jerry has to leave, but I think Shai and Sharon can stick around for... Okay. And I just want to quickly ask one more question. Thank you so much for joining us, Jerry. Shai, one last question for you. The Talmud talks about this notion of Yisurin shel ahava, sufferings that come out of love. And you're someone who's been very open about chronic pain. And a question that I have for you is, how do you sense God's love when you're suffering? How do you love God when you're suffering? And how do you not become jaded to love other people when you're suffering?
Okay, that's a question I was not expecting. I feel like your last question is the one that I can answer most readily, which is that I think it takes a tremendous amount of sort of mental and emotional discipline to commit oneself to the project of learning compassion from one's own suffering. And I think you have a version of that in the Torah. The Torah says, in lines that are so familiar that we cease to hear them anymore, love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And the Torah could have said just the opposite. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. No one did anything for you. Therefore, you don't owe anybody anything. And instead, the Torah says, you were strangers in the land of Egypt. No one did anything for you. Therefore, never be among those who don't do anything for people. That's a choice. That really is a choice and a project. And as we know from the reality of human lives, it's an ongoing project. It doesn't happen once and for all. And to perhaps overshare, one of the things that I personally have been working on a lot in the last couple of years is really being able to admit to myself that illness has taught me not only compassion, but also anger. And the danger of over-pious narratives about yourself is that you create a shadow self. So it's like, if you told me, what do you learn from your illness? Oh, I've learned compassion, right? I'm like the guy in the Karlbach minion, right? But, and it's been a tremendous amount of work. And then comes the next level of spiritual life, which is, how do you learn to be compassionate towards the part of you that doesn't feel compassion? That's actually an internal version of the conversation we just had. So that's really, really important to me. And it's really hard work. It's really an avoda in all the senses of that word. It's service, it's labor, it's hard. The first question you asked is harder for me. I think you said, how I feel the love of God in those moments. Truth is that much of the time I don't. I aspire to. I think that the truth is that it's not usually in moments of suffering that I sense the presence of God. It's in moments of being able to have a life that is not entirely defined by suffering that I sense the presence of God. It's the moment when I can't get out of my bed and my kid climbs into my bed to snuggle, right? It's the moment where it's like, oh, there's still the possibility of immense love and connection, even in the face of all of this. Look, so those people who know me well know that this quote unquote book tour that I'm on is an act of complete insanity on my part, right? So there are three things that you can find me doing at this moment in my life: speaking to an audience, boarding a train or a plane, or lying under a blanket unable to move. Those are the three activities that I have now. And I'll tell you that it's actually extremely spiritually moving to get out of bed after a day of not really being able to move and be able to connect with people in incredibly profound ways and maybe even touch them and move them. Those are moments where I sense the presence of God, and more than that, I sense the command of God. because even sick people have obligations. There's a wonderful line that I so touched by. You know, the Gemara says this really disturbing thing. It says, "Ani hashuv kemet." A poor person is considered like a dead person. And before you're totally offended by that, Chaim Shmulevich, one of the great leaders of the Musar movement, actually interprets this in such an interesting way. He says, the reason is that some poor people become so poor and so defined by poverty that they lose their ability to give. And to lose your ability to give is on some level not to be alive, which is why it's a mitzvah for poor people to give tzedakah. Because giving is part of what keeps them alive. It's very important to me as someone who relies on the help of other people in various ways, given my illness, to sometimes be on the side of giver and not just receiver. It's morally important. It's spiritually important. It's just existentially really important.
I don't think I could overstate the amount that you've given to us this evening and so much in general by this book and your teaching for so many years. So thank you, Shai. We'll have a few minutes of Q&A from the audience, and then we'll also have a book signing outside. Please consider buying the book. It's sponsored by or being sold by the Harvard Bookstore, which is a real staple, key institution of Harvard Square. So I highly encourage you to do that, and then Shai will be signing. And I just want to thank one more time our sponsors for this evening, Gary and Diane Katz, and also our co-hosts, the Lily and Edmund Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard, Hadar, the Harvard Bookstore, and Hebrew College. So we'll take maybe 3 questions from the audience. Please try and keep your questions to be succinct. Sue, so good to see you.
Not working. I'm going to ask 2 questions, and you can answer. You can answer either. First of all, I just want to say that I want to add a dimension to what Sharon said about the book, which is I really feel grateful to be in the world with this book. It makes the world a better place to be, to have your book in it. So thank you, Shai. 2 questions. Based as it is on your rendering of love in Judaism, based as it is in God and God's love for us, how would you expect or want either someone with a God concept that really only, maybe we could say, could be described by adjectives as opposed to verbs, or with no God concept at all? Where should this all sit for them? The second thing I want to ask is about Israel and Gaza. The first question was sponsored by Facebook. Someone had asked that question on Facebook. This question is just sponsored by where we're living. You talked about living in the chasm of people not being loved. I think a lot of us are struggling right now with the chasm of where we are and aren't loving adequately, loving Israelis, loving Gazans, all of the different kinds of pain that we are trying to figure out our loving relationship to. And I just want to ask you to say whatever you want to say about that.
Softballs. Okay, so let me not do justice to either, but say something. We live in a world that is fundamentally ambiguous. In my experience of the world, at least, there are good reasons to believe in God and there are good reasons not to. And if you have 3 hours, I'm happy to make philosophical arguments in both directions. And I feel I have no choice but to live with the reality that I have good reasons to believe and good reasons not to. One of the things that means is that it will be a beautiful day if and when religious people give up on condescension as their fundamental posture towards people who are not believers. When the response to someone who says, I don't believe, is tell me about that, as opposed to let me make you frum, or let me tell you about Christ, or whatever it might be. I say that because many people that I know and love will not relate to the God language, and certainly not to the God language I use, which is pretty traditional. If people who do not share my metaphysical assumptions about the world read this book and are challenged to love better and more deeply, ma tov. I think that's wonderful, and I'm delighted by that. In terms of theology, I'm under no illusions that I'm not engaged in the project of convincing. I'm engaged in the process of describing. As to say, when I do theology, one of the things I am doing is describing what the world looks like when you wear a certain pair of glasses. If those glasses are congenial, you're welcome to them. And if they're not, tell me about yours. I just think that that's what it means to be alive in the world. I do think there are some really interesting discussions for theists and atheists to have about the themes of this book, or these questions in general. Like, one of them is some of the arguments of this book, are there secular counterparts to? Like, can you ground a robust notion of human dignity without God? This is a vexed question in moral philosophy. This is an ongoing debate in human rights theory. It's like actually a really hard question. And to be clear what side I'm on, I would like the non-theists to succeed. I would like Ronald Dworkin to have a coherent notion of dignity, because I think it's more likely to make people who aren't religious care about dignity. And also, religious people should shut up in terms of their condescension to non-religious people when it comes to dignity, because some of the greatest violators of human dignity in the world do so in the name of the God they purport to believe in. So, like, a little humility in this conversation is important, but I think it's nevertheless really difficult. I'm not so convinced that we can have a robust notion of human dignity without a personal God, but that's a different discussion. Some of my favorite students in the world think I'm crazy. One is sitting right there. On this issue, really want me to talk about Gaza. So let me say no. So here's what I'll say about this for a minute. I want to say just a couple of things that I think one could learn from the themes of this book. One is that it is okay, permissible, and arguably even morally required that in moments of trauma, our first reaction is to look out for the interests and needs of our family. I am unapologetically in this book an arguer for what I call partialism, that is, being partial to some people over others. I think impartialism is ultimately morally and psychologically incoherent. And I argue that at great length. That said, it is one of the greatest challenges of people who defend partiality to not allow family first to devolve into family only. And compassion is almost never a vice. Try to say that carefully. Compassion is almost never a vice. Never feels like a very big word to me, but compassion is almost never a vice. And coupled with that, dehumanization is always a theological violation. Always, always, always. That means that no matter what you think about the justice of a war, right? Compassion for the innocent victims that a war claims, and insistence on the humanity, even of your horrible enemies, let alone the innocents caught in the crossfire, is essential to what it means to remain a Jew and a human being. Now, I'm not offering policy prescriptions. That's not the business I'm in. That's not what I do. But I think as a spiritual orientation, that's really important. And the last thing is this, which is we are obviously farther away from this than we have ever been, which is really saying something. But at the end of the day, the only way that Eretz Yisrael will ever be anything other than a bloodbath is if and when people are willing to actually with curiosity and empathy, hear one another's stories and bear witness to one another's experiences. There is a wonderful essay that I often come back to, Moshe Una, who was here's how religious Zionism has changed. Moshe Una was the founder of the religious Zionist peace movement, Oz v'Shalom, and a member of Knesset from the Mafdal, the National Religious Party. I just like put that on your pipe and smoke it for a second, right? Moshe Una has this wonderful essay. He was an educator by training. That's what he did. And he says, I want to talk about chinuch lamoledet, like education to our heritage. He says there's two tasks for those of us who live here in Eretz Yisrael. This is, I think, in the 1980s. I'm not quite sure I remember. He says the first task is to raise our children with an awareness that this land is so unfathomably precious to us. We love every corner of it. We love the plants and we love the leaves and we love the birds. We love it all. And we feel that it is just like an integral part of our soul. It says, and the second task of Chinuch Lamoledet is to educate our kids to know that there's another people that feels the same way about this same place. That's all. By the way, Palestinians have the same moral challenge. They are not exempt from it, despite the ways that much of the West treats Palestinians as if they have no moral agency. They do. It is a robbing of their dignity to claim otherwise.
Thanks. Thank you both. I'm Jeremy. I'm a college senior here. I had the pleasure of reading Maimonides this week for a class and reading.
I thought that you thought it was a pleasure.
Oh, no. Oh, well, it is very good. Okay. But something he says is something like the Torah gives us opinions by which we can love God and commands us to do actions by which we might fear God. And so I'm wondering if fear is like an alternative existential posture we might take. And I think about climate change.
that it was a struggle for me to but what I would say is this: I think self-love is in because the first chapter of this book is about what it means to strive to live with the realization that Sharon alluded to a long time ago. Now, what it means to strive to live with an awareness that God loves us. And part, I think, of living up to God's love is loving that which God loves, which includes oneself. Right? One of the problems of self-loathing is that it's a theological problem. We don't have a right to hate that which God loves. I'm not saying that has to be people who are self-loathing, right? You should loathe yourself as you loathe yourself, right? And people who have depression issues know that now. Not only am I depressed, I'm depressed about my depression, and anxious about my anxiety, and I spiral into the abyss, right? I'm not advocating that. But I am suggesting that there's something I think implicit in accepting some of the fundamental things of theology, some version of self. That's the best I can do, on one foot. But some version of that has to be. Also, psychologically, we know that even if you see it as only instrumental, hating yourself is a very big obstacle to truly loving other people. In the political sphere, right? Martha Nussbaum's work on disgust is really relevant, right? The ways that people take what they don't like about themselves and project it onto minorities, right? So, I think it's interpersonal, but it's also much larger. It's global and political. Some version of self-love we need. We just need to spend some time really understanding what we don't mean by that.
Thank you, Shai, Sharon. Those of you here in person, please do stick around. Shopping and books will be available for purchase just outside. The next program we'll be hosting is virtual online only. And that is next week at 7 o'clock on Thursday with Professor Noah Feldman on his new book. So thank you all so much. Yeah.